Chapter 21 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 21. I don't suppose any of you have ever heard of Patusan, Marlowe resumed after a silence occupied in the careful lighting of a cigar. It does not matter. There's many a heavenly body in the lot crowding upon us of a night that mankind had never heard of, it being outside the sphere of its activities, and of no earthly importance to anybody but to the astronomers, who are paid to talk learnedly about its composition, weight, path, the irregularities of its conduct, the aberrations of its light, a sort of scientific scandal-mongering. Thus with Patusan. It was referred to knowingly in the inner government circles in Batavia, especially as to its irregularities and aberrations, and it was known by name to some few, very few, in the mercantile world. Nobody, however, had been there, and I suspect no one desired to go there in person, just as an astronomer, I should fancy, would strongly object to being transported into a distant heavenly body, where, parted from his earthly emoluments, he would be bewildered by the view of an unfamiliar heavens. However, neither heavenly bodies nor astronomers have anything to do with Patusan. It was Jim who went there. I only meant you to understand that, had Stein arranged to send him into a star of the 5th magnitude, the change could not have been greater. He left his earthly failings behind him, and what sort of reputation he had, and there was a totally new set of conditions for his imaginative faculty to work upon. Entirely new, entirely remarkable, and he got hold of them in a remarkable way. Stein was the man who knew more about Patusan than anybody else, more than was known in the government circles, I suspect. I have no doubt he had been there, either in his butterfly-hunting days or later on, when he tried in his incorrigible way to season, with a pinch of romance, the fattening dishes of his commercial kitchen. There were very few places in the archipelago he had not seen in the original dusk of their being, before light, and even electric light, had been carried into them for the sake of better morality and, well, the greater profit, too. It was at breakfast of the morning following our talk about Jim that he mentioned the place, after I had quoted poor Brierly's remark, let him creep 20 feet underground and stay there. He looked up at me with interested attention, as though I had been a rare insect. "This could be done, too," he remarked, sipping his coffee. "Bury him in some sort," I explained. "One doesn't like to do it, of course, but it would be the best thing, seeing what he is." "Yes, he is young," Stein mused. "The youngest human being now in existence," I affirmed. "Schon. There's Patusan," he went on in the same tone. "And the woman is dead now," he added incomprehensibly. Of course I don't know that story. I can only guess that once before Patusan had been used as a grave for some sin, transgression, or misfortune. It is impossible to suspect Stein. The only woman that had ever existed for him was the Malay girl he called "my wife the princess," or more rarely, in moments of expansion, "the mother of my Emma." Who was the woman he had mentioned in connection with Patusan, I can't say, but from his allusions I understand that she had been an educated and very good-looking Dutch Malay girl, with a tragic, or perhaps only a pitiful, history, whose most painful part, no doubt, was her marriage with a Malacca Portuguese who had been clerk in some commercial house in the Dutch colonies. I gathered from Stein that this man was an unsatisfactory person in more ways than one, all being more or less indefinite and offensive. It was solely for his wife's sake that Stein had appointed him manager of Stein and Company's trading post in Patusan, but commercially the arrangement was not a success, at any rate for the firm, and now the woman had died, Stein was disposed to try another agent there. The Portuguese, whose name was Cornelius, considered himself a very deserving but ill-used person, entitled by his abilities to a better position. This man Jim would have to relieve. "But I don't think he will go away from the place," remarked Stein. "That has nothing to do with me. It was only for the sake of the woman that I... But as I think there is a daughter left, I shall let him, if he likes to stay, keep the old house." Patusan is a remote district of a native-ruled state, and the chief settlement bears the same name. At a point on the river, about 40 miles from the sea, where the first houses come into view, there can be seen, rising above the level of the forests, the summits of two steep hills, very close together, and separated by what looks like a deep fissure, the cleavage of some mighty stroke. As a matter of fact, the valley between is nothing but a narrow ravine. The appearance from the settlement is of one irregularly conical hill split in two, and with the two halves leaning slightly apart. On the third day after the full, the moon, as seen from the open space in front of Jim's house — he had a very fine house in the native style when I visited him — rose exactly behind these hills, its diffused light at first throwing the two masses into intensely black relief, and then the nearly perfect disk, glowing ruddily, appeared, gliding upwards between the sides of the chasm, till it floated away above the summits, as if escaping from a yawning grave in gentle triumph. "Wonderful effect," said Jim by my side. "Worth seeing, is it not?" And this question was put with a note of personal pride that made me smile, as though he had had a hand in regulating that unique spectacle. He had regulated so many things in Patusan, things that would have appeared as much beyond his control as the motions of the moon and the stars. It was inconceivable. That was the distinctive quality of the part into which Stein and I had tumbled him unwittingly, with no other notion than to get him out of the way, out of his own way, be it understood. That was our main purpose, though I own I might have had another motive which had influenced me a little. I was about to go home for a time, and it may be I desired, more than I was aware of myself, to dispose of him. To dispose of him, you understand, before I left. I was going home, and he had come to me from there with his miserable trouble and his shadowy claim, like a man panting under a burden in a mist. I cannot say I had ever seen him distinctly, not even to this day after I had my last view of him. But it seemed to me that the less I understood, the more I was bound to him in the name of that doubt which is the inseparable part of our knowledge. I did not know so much more about myself. And then, I repeat, I was going home, to that home distant enough for all its hearthstones to be like one hearthstone, by which the humblest of us has the right to sit. We wander in our thousands over the face of the earth, the illustrious and the obscure, earning beyond the seas our fame, our money, or only a crust of bread. But it seems to me that for each of us going home must be like going to render an account. We return to face our superiors, our kindred, our friends, those whom we obey and those whom we love. But even those who have neither, the most free, lonely, irresponsible, and bereft of ties, even those for whom home holds no dear face, no familiar voice, even they have to meet the spirit that dwells within the land, under its sky, in its air, in its valleys, and on its rises, in its fields, in its waters, and its trees, a mute friend, judge, and inspirer. Say what you like, to get its joy, to breathe its peace, to face its truth, one must return with a clear conscience. All this may seem to you sheer sentimentalism, and indeed very few of us have the will or the capacity to look consciously under the surface of familiar emotions. There are the girls we love, the men we look up to, the tenderness, the friendships, the opportunities, the pleasures. But the fact remains that you must touch your reward with clean hands, lest it turn to dead leaves, to thorns in your grasp. I think it is the lonely, without a fireside or an affection they may call their own, those who return not to a dwelling but to the land itself, to meet its disembodied, eternal, and unchangeable spirit. It is those who understand best its severity, its saving power, the grace of its secular right to our fidelity, to our obedience. Yes, few of us understand, but we all feel it, though, and I say all without exception, because those who do not feel do not count. Each blade of grass has its spot on earth whence it draws its life, its strength. And so is man rooted to the land from which he draws his faith together with his life. I don't know how much Jim understood, but I know he felt confusedly but powerfully, the demand of some such truth or some such illusion. I don't care how you call it, there is so little difference, and the difference means so little. The thing is that in virtue of his feeling, he mattered. He would never go home now. Not he. Never. Had he been capable of picturesque manifestations, he would have shuddered at the thought and made you shudder too. But he was not of that sort, though he was expressive enough in his way. Before the idea of going home, he would grow desperately stiff and immovable, with lowered chin and pouted lips, and with those candid blue eyes of his glowering darkly under a frown, as if before something unbearable, as if before something revolting. There was imagination in that hard skull of his, over which the thick clustering hair fitted like a cap. As to me, I have no imagination. I would be more certain about him today if I had, and I do not mean to imply that I figured to myself the spirit of the land uprising above the white cliffs of Dover to ask me what I, returning with no bones broken, so to speak, had done with my very young brother. I could not make such a mistake. I knew very well he was of those about whom there is no inquiry. I had seen better men go out, disappear, vanish utterly without provoking a sound of curiosity or sorrow. The spirit of the land, as becomes the ruler of great enterprises, is careless of innumerable lives. Woe to the stragglers! We exist only in so far as we hang together. He had straggled in a way. He had not hung on, but he was aware of it with an intensity that made him touching, just as a man's more intense life makes his death more touching than the death of a tree. I happened to be handy, and I happened to be touched. That's all there is to it. I was concerned as to the way he would go out. It would have hurt me if, for instance, he had taken to drink. The earth is so small that I was afraid of some day being waylaid by a blear-eyed, swollen-faced, besmirched loafer with no soles to his canvas shoes and with a flutter of rags about the elbows, who on the strength of old acquaintance would ask for a loan of $5. You know the awful jaunty bearing of those scarecrows coming to you from a decent past, the rasping, careless voice, the half-averted, impudent glances, those meetings more trying to a man who believes in the solidarity of our lives than the sight of an impenitent deathbed to a priest. That, to tell you the truth, was the only danger I could see for him and for me, but I also mistrusted my want of imagination. It might even come to something worse. In some way it was beyond my power of fancy to foresee. He wouldn't let me forget how imaginative he was, and your imaginative people swing farther in any direction, as if given a longer scope of cable in the uneasy anchorage of life. They do. They take to drink too. It may be I was belittling him by such a fear. How could I tell? Even Stein could say no more than that he was romantic. I only knew he was one of us. And what business had he to be romantic? I'm telling you so much about my own instinctive feelings and bemused reflections because there remains so little to be told of him. He existed for me, and after all it is only through me that he exists for you. I've led him out by the hand. I have paraded him before you. Were my commonplace fears unjust? I won't say, not even now. You may be able to tell better, since the proverb has it that the onlookers see most of the game. At any rate, they were superfluous. He did not go out, not at all. On the contrary, he came on wonderfully, came on straight as a die, and in excellent form, which showed that he could stay as well as spurt. I ought to be delighted, for it is a victory in which I had taken my part, but I am not so pleased as I would have expected to be. I ask myself whether his rush had really carried him out of that mist in which he loomed interesting, if not very big, with floating outlines, a straggler yearning inconsolably for his humble place in the ranks. And besides, the last word is not said, probably never shall be said. Are not our lives too short for that full utterance which through all our stammerings is of course our only and abiding intention? I have given up expecting those last words whose ring, if they could only be pronounced, would shake both heaven and earth. There is never time to say our last word, the last word of our love, of our desire, faith, remorse, submissions, revolt. The heaven and the earth must not be shaken, I suppose, at least not by us who know so many truths about either. My last words about Jim shall be few. I affirm he had achieved greatness, but the thing would be dwarfed in the telling, or rather in the hearing. Frankly, it is not my words that I mistrust, but your minds. I could be eloquent were I not afraid you fellows had starved your imaginations to feed your bodies. I do not mean to be offensive. It is respectable to have no illusions, and safe, and profitable, and dull. Yet you, too, in your time must have known the intensity of life, that light of glamour created in the shock of trifles, as amazing as the glow of sparks struck from a cold stone, and as short-lived, alas. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 22. The conquest of love, honour, men's confidence, the pride of it, the power of it, are fit materials for a heroic tale. Only our minds are struck by the externals of such a success, and to Jim's success there were no externals. 30 miles of forest shut it off from the sight of an indifferent world, and the noise of the white surf along the coast overpowered the voice of fame. The stream of civilization, as if divided on a headland and 100 miles north of Patusan, branches east and south-east, leaving its plains and valleys, its old trees and its old mankind, neglected and isolated, such as an insignificant and crumbling islet between the two branches of a mighty devouring stream. You find the name of the country pretty often in collections of old voyages. The 17th century traders went there for pepper, because the passion for pepper seemed to burn like a flame of love in the breast of Dutch and English adventurers about the time of James I. Where wouldn't they go for pepper? For a bag of pepper they would cut each other's throats without hesitation, and would forswear their souls, of which they were so careful otherwise. The bizarre obstinacy of that desire made them defy death in 1,000 shapes, the unknown seas, the loathsome and strange diseases, wounds, captivity, hunger, pestilence, and despair. It made them great. By heavens, it made them heroic, and it made them pathetic, too, in their craving for trade with the inflexible death levying its toll on young and old. It seems impossible to believe that mere greed could hold men to such a steadfastness of purpose, to such a blind persistence in endeavour and sacrifice. And indeed those who adventured their persons and lives risked all they had for a slender reward. They left their bones to lie bleaching on distant shores, so that wealth might flow to the living at home. To us, their less tried successors, they appear magnified, not as agents of trade, but as instruments of a recorded destiny, pushing out into the unknown in obedience to an inward voice, to an impulse beating in the blood, to a dream of the future. They were wonderful, and it must be owned that they were ready for the wonderful. They recorded it complacently in their sufferings, in the aspect of the seas, in the custom of strange nations, in the glory of splendid rulers. In Patusan they had found lots of pepper, and had been impressed by the magnificence and the wisdom of the Sultan, but somehow, after a century of checkered intercourse, the country seems to drop gradually out of the trade. Perhaps the pepper had given out. Be it as it may, nobody cares for it now. The glory has departed. The Sultan is an imbecile youth with 2 thumbs on his left hand and an uncertain and beggarly revenue extorted from a miserable population and stolen from him by his many uncles. This, of course, I have from Stein. He gave me their names and a short sketch of the life and character of each. He was as full of information about native states as an official report, but infinitely more amusing. He had to know. He traded in so many, and in some districts, as in Patusan for instance, his firm was the only one to have an agency by special permit from the Dutch authorities. The government trusted his discretion, and it was understood that he took all the risks. The men he employed understood that too, but he made it worth their while, apparently. He was perfectly frank with me over the breakfast table in the morning. As far as he was aware, the last news was 13 months old, he stated precisely. Utter insecurity for life and property was the normal condition. There were, in Patusan, antagonistic forces, and one of them was Raja Alang, the worst of the Sultan's uncles, the governor of the river, who did the extorting and the stealing, and ground down to the point of extinction the country-born Malays, who, utterly defenceless, had not even the resource of emigrating. For indeed, as Stein remarked, where could they go, and how could they get away? No doubt they did not even desire to get away. The world, which is circumscribed by lofty, impassable mountains, has been given into the hand of the high-born, and this Rajah they knew. He was of their own royal house. I had the pleasure of meeting the gentleman later on. He was a dirty, little, used-up old man with evil eyes and a weak mouth, who swallowed an opium pill every 2 hours, and in defiance of common decency wore his hair uncovered and falling in wild, stringy locks about his wizened, grimy face. When giving audience he would clamber upon a sort of narrow stage erected in a hall like a ruinous barn with a rotten bamboo floor, through the cracks of which you could see, 12 or 15 feet below, the heaps of refuge and garbage of all kinds lying under the house. That is where and how he received us when, accompanied by Jim, I paid him a visit of ceremony. There were about 40 people in the room, and perhaps 3 times as many in the great courtyard below. There was constant movement, coming and going, pushing and murmuring, at our backs. A few youths in gay silks glared from the distance. The majority, slaves and humble dependents, were half naked, in ragged sarongs, dirty with ashes and mud-stains. I had never seen Jim look so grave, so self-possessed, in an impenetrable, impassive way. In the midst of these dark-faced men, his stalwart figure in white apparel, the gleaming clusters of his fair hair, seemed to catch all the sunshine that trickled through the cracks in the closed shutters of that dim hall, with its walls of mats and a roof of thatch. He appeared like a creature not only of another kind, but of another essence. Had they not seen him come up in a canoe, they might have thought he had descended upon them from the clouds. He did, however, come in a crazy dug-out, sitting, very still and with his knees together for fear of overturning the thing, sitting on a tin box which I had lent him, nursing on his lap a revolver of the navy pattern, presented by me on parting, which, through an interposition of Providence, or through some wrong-headed notion that was just like him, or else from sheer instinctive sagacity, he had decided to carry unloaded. That's how he ascended the Patusan River. Nothing could have been more prosaic and more unsafe, more extravagantly casual, more lonely. Strange, this fatality that would cast the complexion of a flight upon all his acts, of impulsive, unreflecting desertion, of a jump into the unknown. It is precisely the casualness of it that strikes me most. Neither Stein nor I had a clear conception of what might be on the other side when we, metaphorically speaking, took him up and hove him over the wall with scant ceremony. At the moment I merely wished to achieve his disappearance. Stein, characteristically enough, had a sentimental motive. He had a notion of paying off, in kind, I suppose, the old debt he had never forgotten. Indeed, he had been all his life especially friendly to anybody from the British Isles. His late benefactor, it is true, was a Scot, even to the length of being called Alexander MacNeill, and Jim came from a long way south of the Tweed. But at the distance of 6,000 or 7,000 miles, Great Britain, though never diminished, looks foreshortened enough even to its own children to rob such details of their importance. Stein was excusable, and his hinted intentions were so generous that I begged him most earnestly to keep them secret for a time. I felt that no consideration of personal advantage should be allowed to influence Jim, that not even the risk of such influence should be run. We had to deal with another sort of reality. He wanted a refuge, and a refuge at the cost of danger should be offered him, nothing more. Upon every other point I was perfectly frank with him, and I even, as I believed at the time, exaggerated the danger of the undertaking. As a matter of fact, I did not do it justice. His first day in Patusan was nearly his last, would have been his last if he had not been so reckless or so hard on himself and had condescended to load that revolver. I remember, as I unfolded our precious scheme for his retreat, how his stubborn but weary resignation was gradually replaced by surprise, interest, wonder, and by boyish eagerness. This was a chance he had been dreaming of. He couldn't think how he merited that He would be shot if he could see to what he owed. And it was Stein the merchant, who... But of course it was me he had to... I cut him short. He was not articulate, and his gratitude caused me inexplicable pain. I told him that if he owed this chance to anyone especially, it was to an old Scot of whom he had never heard, who had died many years ago, of whom little was remembered besides a roaring voice and a rough sort of honesty. There was really no one to receive his thanks. Stein was passing on to a young man the help he had received in his own young days, and I had done no more than to mention his name. Upon this he coloured, and twisting a bit of paper in his fingers, he remarked bashfully that I had always trusted him. I admitted that such was the case, and added after a pause that I wished he had been able to follow my example. "You think I don't?" he asked uneasily, and remarked in a mutter that one had to get some sort of show first. Then, brightening up and in a loud voice, he protested he would give me no occasion to regret my confidence, which... "Do not misapprehend," I interrupted. "It is not in your power to make me regret anything." There would be no regrets, but if there were, it would be altogether my own affair. On the other hand, I wished him to understand clearly that this arrangement, this experiment, was his own doing. He was responsible for it, and no one else. Why, he stammered, "this is the very thing that I begged him not to be dense, and he looked more puzzled than ever. He was in a fair way to make life intolerable to himself. "Do you think so?" he asked, disturbed, but in a moment added confidently, "I was going on, though, was I not?" It was impossible to be angry with him. I could not help a smile, and told him that in the old days people who went on like this were on the way to becoming hermits in a wilderness. "Hermits be hanged," he commented with engaging impulsiveness. Of course he didn't mind a wilderness. I was glad of it, I said. That was where he would be going to. He would find it lively enough, I ventured to promise. Yes, he said keenly. He had shown a desire, I continued inflexibly, to go out and shut the door after him. Did I? He interrupted, in a strange access of gloom that seemed to envelop him from head to foot like the shadow of a passing cloud. He was wonderfully expressive, after all. Wonderfully. Did I? He repeated bitterly. You can't say I made much noise about it, and I can keep it up too, only confound it, you show me a door. Very well, pass on, I struck in. I could make him a solemn promise that it would be shut behind him with a vengeance. His fate, whatever it was, would be ignored, because the country, for all its rotten state, was not judged ripe for interference. Once he got in, it would be for the outside world as though he had never existed. He would have nothing but the soles of his own 2 feet to stand upon, and he would have first to find his ground at that. Never existed. That's it, by Jove, he murmured to himself. His eyes, fastened upon my lips, sparkled. If he had thoroughly understood the conditions, I concluded, he had better jump into the first gharry he could see and drive on to Stein's house for his final instructions. He flung out of the room before I had fairly finished speaking. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 23. He did not return till next morning. He had been kept to dinner, and for the night. There had never been such a wonderful man as Mr. Stein. He had in his pocket a letter for Cornelius, the Johnny who's going to get the sack, he explained with a momentary drop in his elation. And he exhibited with glee a silver ring, such as natives use, worn down very thin and showing faint traces of chasing. This was his introduction to an old chap called Doraman, one of the principal men out there, a big pot, who had been Mr. Stein's friend in that country where he had all these adventures. Mr. Stein called him War Comrade. War Comrade was good, wasn't it? And didn't Mr. Stein speak English wonderfully well? Said he had learned it in Celebes, of all places. That was awfully funny, was it not? He did speak with an accent, a twang. Did I notice? That chap Dorriman had given him the ring. They had exchanged presents when they parted for the last time, sort of promising eternal friendship. He called it fine. Did I not? They had to make a dash for dear life out of the country when that Mohammed what's-his-name had been killed. I knew the story, of course. Seemed a beastly shame, didn't it? He ran on like this, forgetting his plate, with a knife and fork in hand. He had found me at tiffin, slightly flushed, and with his eyes darkened many shades, which was with him a sign of excitement. The ring was a sort of credential. It's like something you read of in books, he threw in appreciatively, and Dorriman would do his best for him. Mr. Stein had been the means of saving that chap's life on some occasion, purely by accident, Mr. Stein had said, but he, Jim, had his own opinion about that. Mr. Stein was just the man to look out for such accidents. No matter, accident or purpose, this would serve his turn immensely. Hope to goodness the jolly old beggar had not gone off the hooks meantime. Mr. Stein could not tell. There had been no news for more than a year. They were kicking up no end of an all-fired row amongst themselves, and the river was closed. Jolly awkward this, but no fear, he would manage to find a crack to get in. He impressed, almost frightened me with his elated rattle. He was voluble like a youngster on the eve of a long holiday, with the prospect of delightful scrapes, and such an attitude of mind in a grown man, and in this connection had in it something phenomenal, a little mad, dangerous, unsafe. I was on the point of entreating him to take things seriously when he dropped his knife and fork. He had begun eating, or rather swallowing food, as it were, unconsciously, and began a search all round his plate. The ring! Where the devil— Ah, here it was. He closed his big hand on it and tried all his pockets one after another. Jove, wouldn't do to lose the thing. He meditated gravely over his fist. Had it? Would hang the bally affair round his neck. And he proceeded to do this immediately, producing a string, which looked like a bit of cotton shoelace, for the purpose. There, that would do the trick. It would be the deuce if— He seemed to catch sight of my face for the first time, and it steadied him a little. I probably didn't realize, he said with a naive gravity, how much importance he attached to that token. It meant a friend, and it is a good thing to have a friend. He knew something about that. He nodded at me expressively, but before my disclaiming gesture he leant his head on his hand and for a while sat silent, playing thoughtfully with the breadcrumbs on the cloth. "Slam the door, that was jolly well put," he cried, and jumping up began to pace the room, reminding me by the set of his shoulders, the turn of his head, the headlong and uneven stride, of that night when he had paced thus, confessing, explaining, what you will, but in the last instance living before me, under his own little cloud, with all his unconscious subtlety which could draw consolation from the very source of sorrow. It was the same mood, the same and different, like a fickle companion that to-day guiding you on the true path with the same eyes, the same step, the same impulse, tomorrow will lead you hopelessly astray. His tread was assured. His straying darkened eyes seemed to search the room for something. One of his footfalls somehow sounded louder than the other, the fault of his boots presumably, and gave a curious impression of an invisible halt in his gait. One of his hands was rammed deep into his trousers pocket. The other waved suddenly above his head. "Slam the door!" he shouted. "I've been waiting for that. I'll show yet. I'm ready for any confounded thing. I've been dreaming of it. Jove! Get out of this. Jove! This is luck at last. You wait. He tossed his head fearlessly, and I confess that for the first and last time in our acquaintance I perceived myself unexpectedly to be thoroughly sick of him. Why these vapourings? He was stumping about the room, flourishing his arm absurdly, and now and then feeling on his breast for the ring under his clothes. Where was the sense of such exaltation in a man appointed to be a trading clerk, and in a place where there was no trade at that? Why hurl defiance at the universe? This was not a proper frame of mind to approach any undertaking. An improper frame of mind, not only for him, I said, but for any man. He stood still over me. Did I think so? He asked, by no means subdued, and with a smile in which I seemed to detect suddenly something insolent. But then I'm 20 years his senior. Youth is insolent. It is its right, its necessity. It has got to assert itself, and all assertion in this world of doubts is a defiance, is an insolence. He went off into a far corner, and coming back, he, figuratively speaking, turned to rend me. I spoke like that because even I, who had been no end kind to him, even I remembered against him what had happened. And what about others, the world? Where's the wonder he wanted to get out, meant to stay out, by heavens? And I talked about proper frames of mind. It is not I or the world who remember, I shouted. It is you who remember. He did not flinch, and went on with heat. Forget everything, everybody. His voice fell. But you, he added. Yes, me too, if it would help, I said, also in a low tone. After this we remained silent and languid for a time, as if exhausted. Then he began again, composedly, and told me Mr. Stein had instructed him to wait for a month or so, to see whether it was possible for him to remain, before he began building a new house for himself, so as to avoid vain expense. He did make use of funny expressions, Stein did. Vain expense was good. Remain? Why, of course, he would hang on. Let him only get in, that's all. He would answer for it. He would remain. Never get out. It was easy enough to remain. Don't be foolhardy, I said, rendered uneasy by his threatening tone. If you only live long enough, you will want to come back. Come back to what? He asked absently, with his eyes fixed upon the face of a clock on the wall. I was silent for a while. Is it to be never, then? I said. Never, he repeated dreamily, without looking at me, and then flew into sudden activity. Jove, 2 o'clock, and I sail at 4. It was true. A brigantine of Stein's was leaving for the westward that afternoon, and he had been instructed to take his passage in her, only no orders to delay sailing had been given. I suppose Stein forgot. He made a rush to get his things while I went on board my ship, where he promised to call on his way to the outer roadstead. He turned up, accordingly, in a great hurry, and with a small leather valise in his hand. This wouldn't do, and I offered him an old tin trunk of mine, supposed to be watertight, or at least damp-tight. He effected the transfer by the simple process of shooting out the contents of his valise as you would empty a sack of wheat. I saw 3 books in the tumble, 2 small in dark covers, and a thick green and gold volume, a half-crown complete Shakespeare. You read this? I asked. Yes, best thing to cheer a fellow up, he said hastily. I was struck by this appreciation, but there was no time for Shakespearean talk. A heavy revolver and 2 small boxes of cartridges were lying on the cuddy table. Pray take this, I said. It may help you to remain. No sooner were these words out of my mouth than I perceived what grim meaning they could bear. May help you to get in, I corrected myself remorsefully. He, however, was not troubled by obscure meanings. He thanked me effusively and bolted out, calling "Goodbye" over his shoulder. I heard his voice through the ship's side, urging his boatmen to give way, and, looking out of the stern port, I saw the boat rounding under the counter. He sat in her, leaning forward, exciting his men with voice and gestures, and as he had kept the revolver in his hand and seemed to be presenting it at their heads, I shall never forget the scared faces of the 4 Javanese, and the frantic swing of their stroke which snatched that vision from under my eyes. Then, turning away, the first thing I saw were the 2 boxes of cartridges on the cuddy table. He had forgotten to take them. I ordered my gig manned at once, but Jim's rowers, under the impression that their lives hung on a thread while they had that madman in the boat, made such excellent time that before I had traversed half the distance between the 2 vessels, I caught sight of him clambering over the rail, and of his box being passed up. All the brigantine's canvas was loose, her mainsail was set, and the windlass was just beginning to clink as I stepped upon her deck. Her master, a dapper little half-caste of 40 or so, in a blue flannel suit, with lively eyes, his round face the colour of lemon peel, and with a thin little black moustache drooping on each side of his thick dark lips, came forward, smirking. He turned out, notwithstanding his self-satisfied and cheery exterior, to be of a careworn temperament. In answer to a remark of mine, while Jim had gone below for a moment, he said, "Oh yes, Patusan." He was going to carry the gentleman to the mouth of the river, but would never ascend. His flowing English seemed to be derived from a dictionary compiled by a lunatic. Had Mr. Stein desired him to ascend, he would have reverentially, I think he wanted to say respectfully, but devil only knows, reverentially made objects for the safety of properties. If disregarded, he would have presented resignation to quit. 12 months ago he had made his last voyage there, and though Mr. Cornelius propitiated many offertories to Mr. Raja Alang and the principal populations on conditions which made the trade a snare and ashes in the mouth, yet his ship had been fired upon from the woods by irresponsive parties all the way down the river, which causing his crew from exposure to limb to remain silent in hidings, the brigantine was nearly stranded on a sandbank at the bar, where she would have been perishable beyond the act of man. The angry disgust at the recollection, the pride of his fluency, to which he turned an attentive ear, struggled for the possession of his broad, simple face. He scowled and beamed at me, and watched with satisfaction the undeniable effect of his phraseology. Dark frowns ran swiftly over the placid sea, and the brigantine, with her foretopsail to the mast and her main boom amidships, seemed bewildered amongst the cat's paws. He told me further, gnashing his teeth, that the Rajah was a laughable hyena. Can't imagine how he got hold of hyenas, while somebody else was many times falser than the weapons of a crocodile. Keeping one eye on the movements of his crew forward, he let loose his volubility, comparing the place to a cage of beasts made ravenous by long impenitence. I fancy he meant impunity. He had no intention, he cried, to exhibit himself to be made attached purposefully to robbery. The long-drawn wails, giving the time for the pull of the men catting the anchor, came to an end, and he lowered his voice. "Plenty too much enough of Patusan," he concluded with energy. I heard afterwards he had been so indiscreet as to get himself tied up by the neck with a rattan halter to a post planted in the middle of a mud-hole before the Rajah's house. He spent the best part of a day and a whole night in that unwholesome situation, but there is every reason to believe the thing had been meant as a sort of joke. He brooded for a while over that horrid memory, I suppose, and then addressed in a quarrelsome tone the man coming aft to the helm. When he turned to me again, it was to speak judicially, without passion. He would take the gentleman to the mouth of the river at Patusan town, being situated internally, he remarked, 30 miles. But in his eyes, he continued, a tone of bored, weary conviction replacing his previous voluble delivery, the gentleman was already in the similitude of a corpse. What do you say?" I asked. He assumed a startlingly ferocious demeanour, and imitated to perfection the act of stabbing from behind. "Already like the body of one deported," he explained, with an insufferably conceited air of his kind after what they imagine a display of cleverness. Behind him I perceived Jim smiling silently at me, and with a raised hand checking the exclamation on my lips. Then, while the half-caste, bursting with importance, shouted his orders, while the yards swung creaking and the heavy boom came surging over, Jim and I, alone, as it were, to leeward of the mainsail, clasped each other's hands and exchanged the last hurried words. My heart was freed from that dull resentment which had existed side by side with interest in his fate. The absurd chatter of the half-caste had given more reality to the miserable dangers of his path than Stein's careful statements. On that occasion the sort of formality that had been always present in our intercourse vanished from our speech. I believe I called him "dear boy," and he tacked on the words "old man" to some half-uttered expression of gratitude, as though his risk, set off against my years, had made us more equal in age and in feeling. There was a moment of real and profound intimacy, unexpected and short-lived, like a glimpse of some everlasting, of some saving truth. He exerted himself to soothe me as though he had been the more mature of the two. All right, he said rapidly and with feeling. I promise to take care of myself. Yes, I won't take any risks, not a single blessed risk. Of course not. I mean to hang out. Don't you worry. Jove, I feel as if nothing could touch me. Why, this is luck from the word go. I wouldn't spoil such a magnificent chance. A magnificent chance. Well, it was magnificent, but chances are what men make them, and how was I to know? As he had said, even I remembered his misfortune against him. It was true, and the best thing for him was to go. My gig had dropped in the wake of the brigantine, and I saw him aft, detached upon the light of the westering sun, raising his cap high above his head. I heard an indistinct shout, "You shall hear of me!" Of me, or from me, I don't know which. I think it must have been of me. My eyes were too dazzled by the glitter of the sea below his feet to see him clearly. I'm fated never to see him clearly, but I can assure you no man could have appeared less in the similitude of a corpse, as that half-caste croaker had put it. I could see the little wretch's face, the shape and colour of a ripe pumpkin, poked out somewhere under Jim's elbow. He too raised his arm as if for a downward thrust. Absit omen. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Chapter 24. The coast of Patusan, I saw it nearly 2 years afterwards, is straight and sombre, and faces a misty ocean. Red trails are seen like cataracts of rust streaming under the dark green foliage of bushes and creepers clothing the low cliffs. Swampy plains open out at the mouth of rivers, with a view of jagged blue peaks beyond the vast forests. In the offing a chain of islands, dark crumbling shapes, stand out in the everlasting sunlit haze like the remnants of a wall breached by the sea. There is a village of fisher-folk at the mouth of the Patusan branch of the estuary. The river, which had been closed so long, was open then, and Stein's little schooner, in which I had my passage, worked her way up in 3 tides without being exposed to a fusillade from irresponsive parties. Such a state of affairs belonged already to ancient history, if I could believe the elderly headman of the fishing village, who came on board to act as a sort of pilot. He talked to me, the second white man he had ever seen, with confidence, and most of his talk was about the first white man he had ever seen. He called him Tuan Jim, and the tone of his references was made remarkable by a strange mixture of familiarity and awe. They, in the village, were under that lord's special protection, which showed that Jim bore no grudge. If he had warned me that I would hear of him, it was perfectly true. I was hearing of him. There was already a story that the tide had turned 2 hours before its time to help him on his journey up the river. The talkative old man himself had steered the canoe and had marvelled at the phenomenon. Moreover, all the glory was in his family. His son and his son-in-law had paddled, but they were only youths without experience, who did not notice the speed of the canoe till he pointed out to them the amazing fact. Jim's coming to that fishing village was a blessing, but to them, as to many of us, the blessing came heralded by terrors. So many generations had been released since the last white man had visited the river that the very tradition had been lost. The appearance of the being that descended upon them and demanded inflexibly to be taken up to Patusan was discomposing. His insistence was alarming, his generosity more than suspicious. It was an unheard-of request. There was no precedent. What would the Rajah say to this? What would he do to them? The best part of the night was spent in consultation. But the immediate risk from the anger of that strange man seemed so great that at last a cranky dugout was got ready. The women shrieked with grief as it put off. A fearless old hag cursed the stranger. He sat in it, as I've told you, on his tin box, nursing the unloaded revolver on his lap. He sat with precaution, than which there is nothing more fatiguing, and thus entered the land he was destined to fill with the fame of his virtues, from the blue peaks inland to the white ribbon of surf on the coast. At the first bend he lost sight of the sea with its labouring waves forever rising, sinking, and vanishing to rise again, the very image of struggling mankind, and faced the immovable forests rooted deep in the soil, soaring towards the sunshine, everlasting in the shadowy might of their tradition, like life itself. And his opportunity sat veiled by his side like an Eastern bride, waiting to be uncovered by the hand of the master. He, too, was the heir of a shadowy and mighty tradition. He told me, however, that he had never in his life felt so depressed and tired as in that canoe. All the movement he dared to allow himself was to reach, as it were by stealth, after the shell of half a coconut floating between his shoes, and bail some of the water out with a carefully restrained action. He discovered how hard the lid of a block tin case was to sit upon. He had heroic health, but several times during that journey he experienced fits of giddiness, and between whiles he speculated hazily as to the size of the blisters the sun was raising on his back. For amusement he tried, by looking ahead, to decide whether the muddy object he saw lying on the water's edge was a log of wood or an alligator. Only very soon he had to give that up. No fun in it. Always alligator. One of them flopped into the river and all but capsized the canoe. But this excitement was over directly. Then, in a long, empty reach, he was very grateful to a troop of monkeys who came right down on the bank and made an insulting hullabaloo on his passage. Such was the way in which he was approaching greatness, as genuine as any man ever achieved. Principally, he longed for sunset, and meantime his 3 paddlers were preparing to put into execution their plan of delivering him up to the Rajah. "I suppose I must have been stupid with fatigue, or perhaps I did doze off for a time," he said. The first thing he knew was his canoe coming to the bank. He became instantaneously aware of the forest having been left behind, of the first houses being visible higher up, of a stockade on his left, and of his boatmen leaping out together upon a low point of land and taking to their heels. Instinctively he leapt out after them. At first he thought himself deserted for some inconceivable reason, but he heard excited shouts, a gate swung open, and a lot of people poured out, making towards him. At the same time a boatful of armed men appeared on the river and came alongside his empty canoe, thus shutting off his retreat. I was too startled to be quite cool, don't you know, and if that revolver had been loaded I would have shot somebody, perhaps 2, 3 bodies, and that would have been the end of me. But it wasn't. "Why not?" I asked. "Well, I couldn't fight the whole population, and I wasn't coming to them as if I were afraid of my life," he said, with just a faint hint of his stubborn sulkiness in the glance he gave me. I refrained from pointing out to him that they could not have known the chambers were actually empty. He had to satisfy himself in his own way. "Anyhow, it wasn't," he repeated good-humouredly, "and so I just stood still and asked them what was the matter. That seemed to strike them dumb. I saw some of these thieves going off with my box. That long-legged old scoundrel Kasim, I'll show him to you tomorrow, ran out fussing to me about the Rajah wanting to see me. I said, 'All right.' I too wanted to see the Rajah, and I simply walked in through the gate, and here I am." He laughed, and then with unexpected emphasis, "And do you know what's the best in it?" he asked. "I'll tell you. It's the knowledge that had I been wiped out, it is this place that would have been the loser." He spoke thus to me before his house on that evening I've mentioned, after we had watched the moon float away above the chasm between the hills like an ascending spirit out of a grave. Its sheen descended, cold and pale, like the ghost of dead sunlight. There is something haunting in the light of the moon. It has all the dispassionateness of a disembodied soul, and something of its inconceivable mystery. It is to our sunshine, which, say what you like, is all we have to live by, what the echo is to the sound, misleading and confusing whether the note be mocking or sad. It robs all forms of matter, which, after all, is our domain, of their substance, and gives a sinister reality to shadows alone. and the shadows were very real around us, but Jim by my side looked very stalwart, as though nothing, not even the occult power of moonlight, could rob him of his reality in my eyes. Perhaps indeed nothing could touch him, since he had survived the assault of the dark powers. All was silent, all was still. Even on the river the moonbeams slept as on a pool. It was the moment of high water, a moment of immobility that accentuated the utter isolation of this lost corner of the earth. The houses crowding along the wide, shining sweep without ripple or glitter, stepping into the water in a line of jostling, vague, grey, silvery forms mingled with black masses of shadow, were like a spectral herd of shapeless creatures pressing forward to drink in a spectral and lifeless stream. Here and there a red gleam twinkled within the bamboo walls, warm, like a living spark, significant of human affections, of shelter, of repose. He confessed to me that he often watched these tiny warm gleams go out one by one, that he loved to see people go to sleep under his eyes, confident in the security of tomorrow. "Peaceful here, eh?" he asked. He was not eloquent, but there was a deep meaning in the words that followed. "Look at these houses. There's not one of them where I'm not trusted. Jove, I told you I would hang on. Ask any man, woman or child." He paused. "Well, I am all right, anyhow." I observed quickly that he had found that out in the end. I had been sure of it, I added. He shook his head. "Were you?" He pressed my arm lightly above the elbow. "Well then, you were right." There was elation and pride. There was awe almost in that low exclamation. "Jove," he cried, "only think what it is to me." Again he pressed my arm. "And you asked me whether I thought of leaving. Good God, I want to leave, especially now after what you told me of Mr. Stein's. Leave? Why, that's what I was afraid of. It would have been harder than dying. No, on my word, don't laugh. I must feel every day, every time I open my eyes, that I am trusted, that nobody has a right, don't you know. Leave? For where? What for? To get what?" I had told him, indeed it was the main object of my visit, that it was Stein's intention to present him at once with the house and the stock of trading goods on certain easy conditions which would make the transaction perfectly regular and valid. He began to snort and plunge at first. "Confound your delicacy," I shouted. "It isn't Stein at all. It's giving you what you had made for yourself. And in any case, keep your remarks for McNeil when you meet him in the other world. I hope it won't happen soon." He had to give in to my arguments because all his conquests, the trust, the fame, the friendships, the love, all these things that had made him master had made him a captive too. He looked with an owner's eye at the peace of the evening, at the river, at the houses, at the everlasting life of the forests, at the life of the old mankind, at the secrets of the land, at the pride of his own heart. But it was they that possessed him and made him their own to the innermost thought, to the slightest stir of blood, to his last breath. It was something to be proud of. I too was proud, for him, if not so certain of the fabulous value of the bargain. It was wonderful. It was not so much of his fearlessness that I thought. It is strange how little account I took of it, as if it had been something too conventional to be at the root of the matter. No, I was more struck by the other gifts he had displayed. He had proved his grasp of the unfamiliar situation, his intellectual alertness in that field of thought. There was his readiness, too, amazing. And all this had come to him in a manner like a scent to a well-bred hound. He was not eloquent, but there was a dignity in this constitutional reticence. There was a high seriousness in his stammerings. He had still his old trick of stubborn blushing. Now and then, though, a word, a sentence would escape him that showed how deeply, how solemnly, he felt about that work which had given him the certitude of rehabilitation. That is why he seemed to love the land and the people with a sort of fierce egoism, with a contemptuous tenderness. End of chapter 24.